r/AskReddit. Teachers, what was the worst parent/teacher interview you've ever had to sit through? I had a student on an IEP, individual education plan, for his TB, traumatic brain injury. The kid was in SPED and was making decent progress. I always worked with him where I could and at times bent over backwards to ensure he'd graduate. Unofficial district policy was that we were not allowed to fail SPED students. Even if they did absolutely nothing, they still got a D and passed along. His senior year he decides he is embarrassed by the SPED label and he and his mother set up a meeting with our SPED coordinator and principal to remove his SPED status. Both school officials worked their asses off trying to convince them that this was a bad idea, but his mind was made up. He wouldn't come back to school unless we removed the classification. Full disclosure, I work at a shockingly progressive and small rural school. The entire high school has about 60 people, and while people were aware of his TB, no one ever teased him for it or treated him harshly. He had a schedule that was indistinguishable from other high school students. It's not like he was spending giant portions of time in the SPED room or with the coordinator. So he's no longer SPED and loses about 90% of his modification and accommodations. This is where the fun starts. Almost immediately, he is doing terribly. Borderline failing classes, not doing work, can't keep up with the demands that his peers deal with.
Tell your story. On our channel you can find the best animated stories ever! Link is in the description. Check us out now and tell us your story.
After a few weeks the mom calls me and she's absolutely livid. I'm targeting her son, trying to fail him, and I refuse to allow him his modifications and accommodations. Reminder, he doesn't really have any anymore. I forward it up my chain of command and they gently remind her that they literally fucking chose this after being advised not to. Mom isn't happy, but agrees to work with us, monitor him more closely, and get him through senior year. A few weeks later he still isn't doing well. Mom wants a meeting with me, the principal, the SPED coordinator, the school counselor, and the super. Now the problem is that my English workload is too much and unfair to him. I've already been giving this student unlimited time on any assignment he's doing. All he has to do is talk to me and let me know he needs more time, but this isn't enough. Mom demands that he gets unlimited time to do his work and that he only has to do half of each assignment I give out. My admin has my back and basically tells the mom to go fuck herself because I'm already bending over backwards for a student who elected to make school more difficult. Fast forward another few weeks and I'm talking to my principal when the mom happens to call. My principal can tell the call will likely be about me and has me sitting on it silently. The mom apparently decided that it was Hail Mary time. The mom tells the principal that I called her son a fucking retard in front of the whole class and that he's so embarrassed that he can't possibly return. She starts demanding the school pays for online courses to make up the credit without having to go to my class. Goes on about how I've refused to help him when he asks for help, that I'm inflexible and won't work with him, and that I'm intentionally grading him harder than his peers. Admin starts an immediate investigation, locks him down in an office without his phone and starts pulling in his classmates one by one. They question each student about how I'm in class and how I treat the student in question. No one says a single thing that comes close to verifying any of the claims made by his mom. Admin comes down hard on this mom and tells her that they can pay for online courses or they can apologize to me and keep coming to my class. They chose to apologize to me. Getting here very late, and this is a bit long, so it'll probably get buried. I'm no longer a teacher, but when I was, the worst parent/teacher conference I had was an unexpected one where a mother tried to browbeat me into writing a recommendation for her son to study abroad in the US. This was in Korea. I was the native English teacher at a public middle school, but I had the misfortune of my boss knowing I spoke Korean. So I got to deal with the parents directly, which is super uncommon. She walked in wearing a floor-length fur coat and a 2-carat diamond ring and tried to talk down to me. Anyone familiar with the Korean language will know what I mean by this, since she was rich and I was just a teacher. She told me that I had to write her son a recommendation for a fancy private high school in the US because his other English teacher retired and I was the only one who had him as a student. Saying that the kid was a bad student would be an understatement. He was a rich kid who knew he had it made, so he never did any work. He slept in class daily, harassed other students when he wasn't sleeping, and barely passed his English final with a C. He couldn't speak a full sentence and could barely write his name. I told her that I couldn't write him a recommendation, and she went apoplectic with rage. She started yelling at me, calling me names, told me I was worthless, etc. My supervisor had to step in because she could tell I was going to stop being typically Korean, polite, and start being typically American, blunt. Finally, after a bit of back and forth with my supervisor that got nowhere, I told the woman to call her son and make him come to the school right now. They lived in the fancy multi-million-dollar apartments maybe 5 minutes away. He came in, I sat him down, and gave him a speaking test in front of his mother. He couldn't understand or answer a single question. After a few minutes, she turned bright red, grabbed her son, and huffed out. I heard her yelling, "I thought you told me you were good at English." On the way out, he ended up going somewhere in the US, but he was back in less than a semester because he couldn't handle it. A few years ago I was working as a long-term substitute for high school social studies. Long-term subbing is a lot different than day-to-day because you are essentially the teacher of record for as long as you have the class, in my case 3 months. I had a female student who was absolutely terrible in my sophomore world history class. She was very disruptive, often talking during lessons, and when she wasn't doing that, she was glued to her phone. Obviously her grade was terrible, and she was a rising star in softball, so her grades were a big concern for the school. Eventually I had to assign her detention for her repeated classroom disruptions. The next morning as I'm preparing for first period, I get a call over the intercom to come to the office. I'm told that the student and her father are waiting for me. This was about 10 minutes before the start of the first class. No admin had arrived on site yet, so the secretary, who was brand new and has since apologized for this, told me to use one of the assistant principal's offices to talk to the student and parent. This girl's father was furious, but it wasn't for the reason I thought it would be. He explained to me that once he heard that his daughter was assigned detention with a male teacher, he had to intervene. He told me that as someone in the corporate world, he would never put himself in a situation where he was alone with a female. I explained to him that we had several precautions against impropriety. I always left the door open when it was only one student in the room, and each classroom at this school was connected to at least 5 others by a common workroom in the back. He would not hear of it and told me that if I did not figure out a solution, he would be coming back tomorrow and speaking to the principal. Ultimately, when I told this story to the other teachers, our oldest female teacher became pretty incredulous and volunteered to take the student and put her to work for her detention. If it had just been with me, all she would have had to do was sit quietly. This one still bothers me, even though it was a decade ago. I taught high school. The day before school started for the new year, the principal pulled me aside. I would be having a student in my class, she said, who had recently experienced trauma. All of the student's siblings had been murdered in their home by a family member who then killed himself. The girl got home minutes later, found the bodies, and had to call police. Parents were at work. I had read about it in our local paper a month earlier, and it was a shocking crime. Principal asks me to take it easy on her, which of course, I was absolutely going to do. I meet her the next day. She's very quiet, nearly silent. The semester moves on. She's absent quite a bit, but that's for the school to deal with, not me. And when she odes in classwork, it's all good. She's a B/C student. But she doesn't turn in work, misses quizzes, that kind of thing. Sometimes, she would simply get up and leave the room and I would get an email that she was in the office having a breakdown. The principal and I decide that her grade will be based on work she completed and turned in. Her parent never moved out of the house after the murders and in fact, left things the way they were, bloodstained, for months. Bad stuff is happening, and if I give this poor kid the grade she actually earned, it's an F not doing that. Report card goes out, and she has a solid C. Her parents request a conference with me. I had no idea what I was walking into, and if I could go back in time, I would warn myself. Here I am, thinking they want to discuss helping her or whatever, but no. The dad barrels into my room yelling, says his daughter is an A student and I'm punishing her because I blame them for the murders. Mom is crying. They brought the kid with them and she's basically catatonic. Dad starts punching my desk, screaming that I'm evil and adding to his family's pain. Every time he hit my desk, papers would fall off and the computer would rattle. I was terrified he was going to hit me next. The commotion alerts some staff still there. This was after school. I'm just sitting there, letting this guy scream at me. I was paralyzed. 10 minutes in, the vice principal shows up, having followed the sounds of screaming. Dad directs his rage to this guy, who handled it pretty well. Turns out, all the other teachers had given this girl an A. I had no idea and thought I was being fair. Dad honestly thought I was giving her a bad grade on purpose. They pulled her out of school and blamed me for doing so. Later, I heard she ran away. Always hoped she found peace. And always wished I could have explained that I liked their kid, felt horrible about their tragedy, and was not evil. I wonder if they still hate me. My first ever parent-teacher conference that was actually set up by my principal. My school does these things called Friday folders. Any important shit, like news about fundraisers and PTO newsletters goes in this folder, to be signed and returned on Monday. I stuffed every folder myself every fucking Friday because first graders are incapable of picking up papers and putting them in a folder without losing something. I mean, I have to teach them how to carry the folder so nothing falls out. Anyways, my principal comes to me and says, "What's the deal with Ella?" I say, she's fine I guess. Why? My principal tells me that Ella's mother has called her and complained that I'm not sending home papers in Ella's Friday folder that every other student is getting. Why Ella's mother couldn't fucking tell me this, but instead went over my head to my boss is beyond me. So Ella's mom, my principal, my mentor, and myself set up this meeting to discuss the missing Friday folder flyers. She tells me her complaint that her kid isn't getting important information and flyers that every other kid is getting. I assure her that I stuff every folder and I have no reason to skip her precious snowflakes folder, so I'm not sure where the papers are going, but perhaps they're falling out. In the future, if she feels like she's not getting them, she could just send me an email and I'll send another one home. Finally she says that she did find one flyer in another part of her kid's backpack and she wasn't sure how it got there. Now, after teaching Ella for a year and seeing her on the playground, I know that Ella is a very sneaky manipulative kid. So essentially this child was removing papers and fucking hiding them from her mother and the mother refused to acknowledge it, though it was very obvious to all of us in the meeting. I had this student who had a textbook case of dyslexia. He was so smart, able to use vocabulary correctly a couple grade levels ahead, was ahead in his understanding of time, and had an amazing understanding of space, but he had a really hard time with reading. I found out through some relatives, small town, that their family had a long history of dyslexia as well. So we called in the parents for an ARD to allow testing. First conference, they never showed. Second conference, they never showed. Third conference, we had an aide stand out in the car drop-off line and remind mom about the conference. She said she would be there. She never showed. So special ed paid for me to have a sub for the day and did the same thing again. Reminded mom, but this time, continually called until mom and dad finally showed up. They were very angry from the get-go. Why do seem to think my son is stupid. They accused me of being a terrible teacher and any struggling their son had was my fault. Even his bad attendance rate was somehow my fault. I felt like I had a target on my back. We asked about family history and they denied anyone having it in their family. It couldn't be that. It's because I'm the worst teacher in the world. At the end, they finally signed the paperwork and let him get tested. The head of special ed for the district had me stick around after they left. Told me that I handled it so well. She was very impressed and admired me. She also said that it was one of the worst she'd ever experienced in her 20+ year career. He did all the tests, and I was right. Now it's time for a meeting, where we go over the results, and decide together what services he should get. They actually came to this one. Before we could even go over anything, Mom said something about when his uncle, my brother-in-law, got diagnosed with dyslexia. The head of special ed started saying pretty loudly, "Did you catch that? Family history. It's very important that we document family history." They tried to argue with the results, but eventually gave in to allowing him the help he deserves. At the end of the year they gave me a card that started with, "I know we didn't always get along," and, somewhere in there, actually said, "I didn't like you, but there was a gift there too, so that's cool I guess." Our worst parent-teacher interview happened last week, and the parent wasn't even there. Note, our school is unusual in that it only operates 1 day per week. Basically, an assessment task was scheduled on the last day of term and he wasn't there. The office ladies asked me to call his house to see if he could come in, and explained that if he didn't he would not have enough units to gain a HSC. Mum answers the phone and explains Stefan is not there because he has gone to work with his father for some reason. I explained how important it was that he was present, and she suddenly realized that her son was still asleep in bed, which she may have known already. She puts her son on the phone and I explained he needed to get his ass to school as soon as possible. He said he thought he was on holidays and couldn't come to school because his dad had taken the car to work and public transport would not get him to school in time. At that point I told him he needed to figure it out and said goodbye. Later I felt bad for the kid and called back, explaining that if he was feeling sick, he could get a medical certificate which would allow him to take the assessment task on the first day of the next term. He didn't get it until I spelled it out for him, but eventually agreed that yes, he was feeling sick and yes, he could get a doctor to write a medical certificate. I felt pretty good about myself for bending the rules for him until the first day of next term rolls around, and young Stefan is nowhere to be seen. Nor was he there next week, at which point we called him up again. He hadn't bothered to get a medical certificate and wasn't able to come last week because he had to go to a baby shower. Yes, really. We asked to speak to his father, who he put on the phone, although we are sure it was just Stefan with a different voice, and tell him to come in with Stefan to discuss his enrollment. Turns out we had only been gifted with his presence for a single day last term. Soon Stefan walks through the door, but we immediately detected a distinct lack of dad. Somehow, in the meeting with the principal he avoided the expulsion he so richly deserved, and has promised he will come in next week to do the assessment task, along with a fistful of medical certificates. I doubt we will be seeing him again. I used to teach senior English for 10 years. It was pretty much the only class anyone had to absolutely take senior year, unless they were behind on their 3 math or science courses. The course was specifically British literature and I tried to make it as interesting as possible for students. I tried to challenge students and prepare them for college level work, but I also allowed students to turn in late assignments for points off. My district also unofficially required us to accept late work, as failed students equals LESS funding. I posted all assignments on the class website for all students to access in the event of an absence, held tutorial once a week, updated my online grades weekly, and contacted parents when students were failing. I did all of this because in the event a student fails, you have to provide supporting documentation that you tried to help them. Every year, I had 2 or 3 male students. I don't know why it was usually guys who wouldn't complete any assignments. These kids usually had overbearing mothers who would constantly harass me and find every excuse in the book to present some fault of mine to my principal as reasoning their son shouldn't be failing. These parents' usual excuse was that they didn't know their kid was failing, despite the access to online grades, my phone calls, letters home, etc. On one such occasion I was called into a meeting with a mother a month prior to graduation. Her son had failed first semester, and I was a bit surprised to see her, because she had been fairly nonchalant in our previous phone calls, saying things like, "If he fails, that's on him." Well, this lady pulled out the big guns for this Hail Mary meeting. She first said I never called her, and she didn't know her son was failing. I presented my documentation on our phone calls, and quoted what she said, word for word. She then stated that I was too tough on students and wanted to fail her son. I reminded her that I hold weekly tutorial for students, post all assignments online, and give students time to work on assignments in class. Then, she bitched about not knowing her son failed first semester until it was too late because his report card was sent to the wrong address. My principal pulled up their information and read back the address. She commented, "Yeah, that's my sister's house." My principal asked her for her current address and she gave it. He paused, then said, "Ma'am, your address is outside of our attendance zone." Realizing the mistake she made, the lady got quiet for a moment then snapped, "My son will make up all of the work he owes for your class and attend every tutorial for the remainder of the year," and he did. I've shared this in another AskReddit, but it's a goodie. I was at my previous school when it opened 5 years ago. Long story short, when the school opened, we only had about 6 or so weeks to get our act together and, as a result, admitted some students we were not equipped to handle. I was a special education teacher at the time and had a young man on my caseload who had a dual diagnosis of autism and emotional disturbance. Technically not possible under idea, but the kid came from a notoriously shady district. The boy had previously attended an alternative placement where, from what inferred, he'd spent most of his time being placated on the computer. None of his social/emotional goals were being addressed, and his academics had clearly fallen by the wayside. Very quickly, his behaviors occupied so much of my time I could get not other responsibilities done. I think my personal favorite time was when he ripped the electrical outlet covers off the sockets, then threw them at the guidance counselor and I, while screaming that we were both fat bastards. Given that we'd only been open a short amount of time and our resources were extremely limited, to this day I still feel my coworkers and I did our best to help the child. However, his mother was a two-faced liar, and I got the impression she was into some shady shit. The kid was a piece of work, but I can't place too much blame on a 10-year-old when he was clearly a product of his environment. Flash forward 3-ish months. The boy was suspended for bringing a weapon, think it was a pocket knife, to school and we brought him and his mother in for a reinstatement meeting. We principal and I had also drafted papers requesting a re-evaluation, since it was pretty obvious his prior eval/IEP did not reflect his actual needs. Mom spent the whole meeting flipping the F out, saying down she was done with shit, tired of getting phone calls, etc. Meanwhile, the boy was kicking my shins under the conference table as I tried not to react. Keep in mind that this was in the front office during morning drop-off, so the entire school community is witnessing this tirade. Seriously, later that day, kids I'd never met before asked if I was okay. The mother is pounding the table, getting in the principal's and my face when, wham, out of nowhere, our school secretary comes out and basically body checks this woman. The secretary then dragged her from the building, screaming, "You need to leave now." The son follows suit and he and mom drive off. We called the police. I had to give a statement, and I spent the next 10 days in fear that he and his mother would return to school before we could officially drop him from our roster. I teach 7th grade math and my worst parent-teacher interview happened this year. We have 2 meetings, one in November and the second one in February. I have met the mother of this student in November. Her son was failing, and she wanted to know why. I explained to her that her son wasn't answering all the questions of his tests. Almost half of the questions were blank. I even showed her his last test. That interview went alright. Then I noticed that this student was starting to show more difficulties. He was the only one that wasn't improving. I wrote her an email explaining the situation. I told her every I had done since our meeting and expressed my concerns. She never answered me. Instead, she and her husband took a meeting with my boss to complain about me. He took my defense and asked me to call them back, which I did. She seemed upset, for reasons unnecessary for the story of this thread, but she accepted my explanations in the end. Then came the second meeting. She arrived with her husband. Their son was still failing, and his grades had dropped since the first meeting. I don't remember every detail of this meeting, but I wasn't even able to put a word. The father was complaining, and complaining. He was complaining about absurd things like that my tests are too long. When I was able to say something and would show him that he was wrong in what he was accusing me, he would change the subject and find something else to complain. The thing you need to understand is that he was really aggressive. Even though I'm a man myself, I wasn't feeling too good. His voice was rising, He was clearly getting angrier because he didn't like any of my answers. Instead of being mad about his son, he was mad about me. Like I said, I teach math and I give a lot of homework. My students start their exercises in class and they have to finish it for the next course. So if they finish in my class they don't have any homework, or they have a 10 to 15 minutes homework to finish at home. Each time a student didn't finish/do a homework I give them a 30 minutes detention. I always worked that way. So the parents were complaining that I once said that the homework of their child wasn't done because he didn't do his steps, he only wrote his answer on 3 numbers. I explained to them that I have asked since September to my students to always show me their steps, or they could have simply copied their homework or simply wrote anything to make me think they did their homework. Then the father started to complain that it wasn't written on the exercise, leave your steps. At that moment I realized there was nothing to do with them, and I asked them to leave. They were shocked, and I had to insist a few more times. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe the channel.